In the cradle of ancient Athens, under the towering shadow of the Parthenon, a profound question hung heavy in the air. What truly constitutes the good life? It was not a simple query for a young mind to grasp. The student gazed upon the marble structures, perfect embodiments of human aspiration, yet felt an overwhelming sense of mystery. He was adrift in a sea of possibility, faced with the sheer vastness of human desire and the daunting weight of philosophical inquiry. The world around him pulsed with immediate concerns. Some chased the fleeting pleasures offered by lavish feasts. Others were consumed by the promise of power and military glory. These pursuits seemed to define success, but they left a lingering emptiness in his soul, like an echo after a great shout. He began to suspect that these external markers, gold, fame, might, were merely distractions from the deep truth he sought. The initial question deepened into an internal conflict. Was happiness found through acquisition or through understanding? The first lessons were about elimination. Observing the opulent merchant in the agora, the student saw stacks of beautiful silks and gleaming coins. He watched as these riches accumulated, yet he noted something disturbing, a certain weary resignation in the eyes of the owner. The possessions did not seem to bring lasting joy. They seemed merely to complicate it. This observation led him to set aside the allure of material wealth. If earthly accumulation could not satisfy the deepest yearning, then where, he wondered, must true fulfillment reside? This philosophical process became a methodical stripping away of misconception. He realized that judging life by what one owns was flawed. Value resided not in external objects, but in the inner landscape of the human spirit itself. The student began to challenge the common understanding of good. If all paths led to varying shades of dissatisfaction, there must be a foundational principle, a core virtue that stabilized the soul. The intellectual journey then turned inward, focusing on the tempestuous state of emotion. He encountered moments of intense vulnerability. A sharp word from a passing stranger could spark immediate anger, hot and disproportionate. Failure, even in small matters, threatened to plunge him into despair. These emotional flares were sudden and powerful, controlling his actions before reason had time to catch up. He experienced the raw, untamed self, reacting purely on impulse. A quieter voice of reasoned thought persisted within him, a persistent echo challenging the reactive mind. It urged pause. When anger flared, he was prompted not merely to suppress it, but to question its origin and measure its true need. The intellectual challenge was thus twofold. First, how to identify the emotional extreme, and second, how to guide the wild heart back toward moderation. The concept that emerged was profound, yet subtle: balance. He began to observe himself during moments of feeling, trying to navigate the difficult terrain between excess and deficiency. Too much fear rendered him paralyzed. Too much confidence made him arrogant and blind. The ideal state, he gradually understood, was not indifference, but a thoughtful calibration, a way of existing precisely at the mean, where virtue resided. This moderateness in emotion became the central pillar of his emerging philosophy. But this moderation could not exist solely within the realm of feeling. It needed intellectual sustenance. The student found himself drawn away from the bustling marketplace and into the cool quietude of the library. Here, surrounded by scrolls and volumes detailing human history and ethical thought, a different kind of satisfaction took root. It was a profound, deep joy that came not from physical action or social validation, but purely from understanding. This act of contemplation, the pure dedication to knowledge and truth, began to present itself as an end unto itself, a supreme good. Yet the spirit found quickly that knowledge alone was inert. Simply knowing what justice was, reading about courage, did not automatically make one just or courageous. The wisdom found in the texts was like unworked marble. It demanded the chisel of action. Aristotle's emphasis became clear. Virtue is a habit. It must be practiced repeatedly until it becomes natural and effortless. One does not simply read oneself into becoming temperate. One must actively choose restraint day after day. This commitment to embodied practice shifted his focus from theory to reality. The practical application of this philosophy led him out of the quiet library and into the messy realities of community life. He found himself tasked with mediating a dispute between two stubbornly opposed neighbors. They represented wills and grievances that refused any compromise. In resolving their conflict, he discovered that virtue was not a private shield for the self. It was inherently communal. True justice required empathy, the ability to feel the weight of another person's pain or grievance, and an active commitment to restoring equilibrium between conflicting needs. His virtue had to flow outward. The philosophical quest then entered a phase of deep immersion. He began dedicating himself to skilled activities, whether it was complex rhetorical debate or the careful craft of woodworking. In these moments, something remarkable happened. He stopped observing himself and simply became what he was doing. Time seemed to dissolve. This state, this flow, demonstrated that natural excellence, the kind where skill meets challenge effortlessly, was a potent source of profound joy and self-realization. It suggested that optimal existence required the full engagement of one's best capacities. Yet, even with all these internal gains, moderation, contemplation, skilled action, a crucial piece remained missing: connection. He realized that life was not meant to be lived in perfect, self-contained philosophical detachment. Meaningful relationships gave his inner virtuous core its necessary color and support structure. Friendships, he learned, were the essential compass, directing him toward a richer, more connected existence. They affirmed his values and provided a vital sounding board for his developing character. The journey eventually forced him to confront some of the hardest lessons: loss and limitation. He faced moments that represented profound disappointment or unavoidable decay, a passing season, an irreversible personal setback. Here, he struggled against the natural human impulse to fight what is inevitable. The emerging wisdom taught him acceptance. It was not resignation. It was a disciplined recognition of boundaries, understanding the limits of his power, and the vast space between what he desires and what fate permits. By practicing this detachment from outcomes, he found an unexpected freedom. The culmination arrived with the synthesis of all these disparate elements. He had learned through contemplation, restraint, action, community service, skilled focus, and acceptance. The word that finally encompassed this entire state was eudaimonia. It was often mistranslated by modern ears as mere happiness, a light, passing emotion. But Aristotle defined it far more loftily. It was not a single reward to be received. It was the active, sustained process of flourishing. It was living according to one's highest potential, year after year. And finally, he grasped that this state was never an endpoint to be reached and admired from a distance. Wisdom is perpetually incomplete. The journey to eudaimonia is not a final destination, but an ongoing apprenticeship. Every day demands discipline, curiosity, and the difficult commitment to bettering oneself, intellectually, morally, and relationally. Life, he realized, was not about finding the answer. It was about becoming the careful, deliberate practice of asking questions until one's soul achieves its highest possible form of continuous unfolding. This continuous effort, this disciplined striving toward excellence, was, in itself, the definition of a life worth living. The city of Athens buzzed with a life that seemed impossibly vibrant. From this vantage point, the young seeker had spent weeks accumulating lessons. He understood now that glory was fleeting, and wealth offered only temporary comfort. Yet, even after shedding the illusion of material success, a subtle dissatisfaction remained. It felt as if something fundamental were still out of reach, hidden just beyond the polished marble and the roar of the market. The world outside the academic courtyard presented constant examples of this struggle. He watched groups of merchants passing by, their stalls piled high with exotic goods, silks from the east, spices from distant lands. They boasted not merely of their earnings, but of the sheer volume of what they owned. For these men, success was measured in coinage, a quantifiable metric that promised security and status. But as he observed them boasting, something troubled his inner understanding. There was a hollowness in their pride, a kind of frantic display meant to signal worth, yet achieving nothing more than exhausting the onlookers. He saw neighbors arguing over property lines, escalating disputes fueled by greed. He witnessed families spending fortunes on transient luxuries, collecting beautiful but empty things, statues for show, robes that faded with season. These actions seemed driven by a persistent misunderstanding, the belief that acquisition equaled fulfillment. They were trying to fill the vast emptiness within themselves with glittering external possessions. The seeker paused, his gaze drifting from the dazzling commotion of the port toward the quiet shade of an olive tree. If life was truly about finding the good, surely it could not rely on such fragile, mutable things. Wealth can be lost in a single raid. Glory is always transient, whispered into oblivion by time. These external supports were merely stage dressing for a deeper play. The lesson crystallized. Chasing gold and clinging to public acclaim were ultimately pointless endeavors. They provided momentum, perhaps, but never direction, and they certainly did not constitute the source of true inner peace. This was a turning point in his philosophical journey, a moment that required him to dismiss entire categories of desired achievement. He learned to observe these superficial pursuits without judgment, seeing them simply as human patterns of behavior rooted in deep-seated insecurity. The yearning for more, whether it be a larger villa or a grander title, seemed less about genuine need and more about proving something to an imagined audience. It was a desperate performance of worthiness. This realization cleared the slate entirely. If external validation, whether through amassed wealth or public adoration, was unreliable at best, then the search for the good life must shift its focus. The answer could not lie beyond these city walls, held captive by perishable materials and shifting political tides. It had to be located within the durable architecture of the soul itself. The discarded symbols of external success gave way to a demanding question. If possessions do not make us good, then what internal landscape is required? He found himself questioning every assumption he had built up about human aspiration. Was happiness truly contingent upon having enough? Or was it something that could be cultivated, nurtured like a difficult garden, regardless of the soil's quality? This introspection pushed him toward an understanding of self-sufficiency, not in the manner of withdrawing entirely from society, for humanity required community, but rather in developing a core state of being impervious to external shocks. He began to see that the truest mastery was not over things, but over his own internal reactions to those things. The path forward demanded a radical reevaluation of what good even meant. It could no longer be merely the outcome, a feast, a treaty signed, a pile of coins. the good life, he realized with a sudden intellectual shock, might instead be defined by the quality and discipline applied to the journey itself. It required turning inward, away from the noisy marketplace of desires, toward the quiet, disciplined echo chamber of pure thought and examined action. This profound shift marked his necessary departure from judging man by his portfolio or his reputation, guiding him instead towards the steady, enduring pursuit of self-mastery. The initial lessons had been clear. We understood that external goods, the gold, the fleeting praise, the swift victory, could not sustain the soul. To seek happiness outside of oneself was to build a magnificent palace upon shifting sand. But wisdom is never simply a declaration. It demands confrontation. It requires us to face the raw, untamed corners of our own hearts. Consider this moment, confronted by failure, challenged by scorn, or betrayed by trust. The immediate reaction is visceral. A hot surge of indignation rushes through the veins, demanding vengeance, demanding explanation. We are pulled toward extremes, the burning rage, the paralyzing despair. Our emotional life becomes a battlefield, and in the chaos, reason often takes temporary leave. These raw feelings, these intense swells of passion, feel overwhelming, dictating our every thought and action. They promise immediate release. Scream it out, bottle it up, or numb yourself completely. To be ruled by mere impulse is to live a life fragmented and reactive. We mistake this emotional intensity for depth, believing that the magnitude of our feeling equals the truth of our experience. It does not. Here, in the midst of internal turmoil, comes the necessary intervention, the voice of self-reflection. The philosophical gaze demands a profound pause. It challenges us to step back from the precipice of emotion, to observe the storm rather than become consumed by it. To master our emotions is not about suppression. That would be denying a natural part of the human experience. Rather, it is about mastery, understanding the mechanics of our own inner world. The deepest challenge lies in separating what we truly feel from how we choose to interpret that feeling. For instance, when another person insults us, the initial sting triggers a cascade of assumptions. They mean to hurt me. I am unworthy. I must retaliate. But reasoned thought demands an examination of these origins. Are my feelings triggered by objective reality, or are they colored by past wounds and unexamined beliefs? This distinction is monumental. It requires us to recognize that our emotions are not inevitable responses. They are judgments. They are labels we quickly affix to events. This is intolerable. That is unacceptable. You must feel this way. The raw experience, the loud noise, the confusing setback, is simply data. Our emotional response is merely a deeply ingrained interpretation of that data. To truly learn self-control, therefore, means adopting a posture of thoughtful inquiry before reacting. When anger flares, we must pause and ask, what specifically has offended me? Is it the action itself, or my belief about what that action means for my worth? When despair threatens to overwhelm, we ask, is this sadness rooted in what has been lost, or in the expectation of how things were supposed to be? This act of disciplined questioning introduces a critical gap between stimulus and response. It is within this cultivated space that freedom resides. This internal battle teaches us that many emotional extremes are unsustainable states. The burning peak of excessive confidence often leads to reckless downfall, while the deep valley of hopelessness breeds stagnation. Aristotle guides us towards seeking the mean, the balanced ground between two excesses. This mean is not merely compromise, it is calibrated action, a reasoned pitch perfectly suited to the situation and our character. The goal here is emotional equilibrium, a state where our feelings are potent, engaged, yet grounded by reason. We aim for an inner citadel that withstands external assaults, not by becoming indifferent, but by recognizing the limits of what we can control. Our peace must reside within our judgment, not in the unpredictable temperament of others. The mastery of feeling is thus a constant apprenticeship. It means accepting the inherent messiness of life while refusing to let that mess dictate the quality of one's soul. It is learning to feel deeply, empathy, genuine joy, righteous frustration, but always ensuring that reason remains the pilot guiding the ship through emotional storms. We have spent time examining the pillars of a good life. We dismissed the easy answers, mere accumulation of wealth or fleeting bursts of glory. These external rewards prove to be hollow, leaving the spirit restless and unfulfilled. The journey inward began by mastering our raw emotions. We learned that anger and despair are not inevitable responses to hardship. Rather, they are judgments we make about those hardships. To truly live well, one must first build a quiet space between the stimulus of life and the moment of reaction. This required rigorous self-control and reflection. But internal balance is more than just stopping bad reactions. It is about finding the perfect pitch of feeling. Aristotle taught us that virtue resides in what we call the golden mean. He argued that human emotion, like all things, exists on a spectrum, pulled by two opposing extremes. To find moderation was not simply to feel less. It was to locate a sustainable, thoughtful center point between excesses and deficiencies. Consider fear and confidence. The excessive state is recklessness, a fool who acts without considering consequence. The deficient state is cowardice, the paralysis of inaction. The mean is courage. Courage does not mean never feeling fear. It means acting rightly even when the instinct screams for retreat. It requires acknowledging the danger while prioritizing a commitment to principle. Similarly, consider pleasure and pain. An overwhelming excess leads to hedonism, giving way to shallow indulgence. A deficient state results in ascetic deprivation, punishing the self out of misplaced severity. The mean is sensible joy, a deep satisfaction derived from living virtuously, recognizing that true happiness is found not at the peak or the valley of feeling, but on the plateau of balanced moderation. The greatest challenge here was accepting that these means were not fixed rules etched in stone, but rather a skill set. They demanded practice. Understanding courage through theory was vastly different from finding it when faced with a genuine threat. One must train their emotional muscles daily, adjusting one's response to every minor frustration, every small slight, and every predictable disappointment until the balanced reaction becomes second nature. It is an active process of calibration. This commitment to moderation taught us profound lessons about judgment itself. The good life requires a finely tuned sense of appropriateness. When we are faced with a situation, a professional failure, a personal insult, or a moment of intense joy, the virtuous person does not swing wildly from one emotional pole to the next. Instead, they pause, observe the reality of the moment without adding their own catastrophic narrative, and select a measured response that aligns with reasoned excellence. The life built upon these balanced feelings is inherently resilient. If you react too strongly to every setback, every harsh word, or every perceived injustice, your emotional structure will crumble under normal pressure. But if you can locate the mean, that thoughtful spot where impulse meets reason, you gain a stable foundation. This stability is crucial because it allows us to move outward from ourselves, realizing that internal calm is not a reward for passing tests. It is the prerequisite condition for effective action in the world. This emotional discipline sets the stage for our next inquiry. How does this personal moderation translate into a life of pure intellectual pursuit? The mind, we discover, has its own unique form of flourishing. To explore that transition, we must understand the power and necessity of contemplation. After confronting the superficial glitter of external praise and realizing that mere accumulation held no power over the soul, the philosophical journey narrowed its focus to something quieter, more elusive. It was not in the clamor of the marketplace or the triumph of the public forum that true understanding resided. Instead, the student found himself drawn toward a tranquil corner of knowledge, the library, a monument built not of spoils but of thought. Here, amidst towering shelves of scrolls and codices, he began to explore the nature of contemplation. He came to understand that many pursuits, while valuable, were inherently mixed. They combined elements of action, emotion, and utility, making them dependent on circumstances. Success in war, skill at craft, or justice within a community. Yet, a distinct sphere existed, the life dedicated purely to knowing, to understanding the fundamental laws of existence itself. Contemplation was this pure act, requiring nothing outside the mind save its own disciplined focus. At first, he viewed it with some suspicion. Action seemed robust. The physical struggle, the skillful execution, felt more tangible, more immediately rewarding than the delicate process of deep thought. How could mere thinking sustain a life? How was wisdom to be equated with virtue if it did not result in visible, external acts of kindness or defense? Yet, as he immersed himself in the texts and engaged with ideas, a profound shift occurred. He began to perceive that this life of pure reflection held a unique dignity. It demanded a different kind of training than the athletic discipline of action or the emotional moderation required for social living. It was a mastery over distraction, a continuous act of filtering the chaotic noise of daily existence until only the clearest signal remained: knowledge. This pursuit revealed itself to be more than simply reading books. It was a way of structuring one's entire being around intellectual inquiry. To contemplate meant living in a state of perpetual questioning, always seeking definitions, origins, and underlying causes. It established a deep kinship with the great thinkers who had preceded him, a conversation that spanned centuries, conducted solely through the disciplined exchange of ideas. He realized that when the mind was fully engaged in its own highest function, it achieved a profound, almost effortless state of fulfillment. This state, he gradually learned, suggested that the greatest goods were those which could not be stolen, lost to fate, or diminished by political upheaval. They resided solely within the citadel of the intellect. This understanding was not a dismissal of action. On the contrary, it enriched his view of action by establishing its proper place in the hierarchy of human good. He understood that while virtue requires constant physical and emotional practice, the habituation of kindness or the moderation of fear, contemplation provided the intellectual framework for judging what was truly virtuous to begin with. It gave him the tools not just to react correctly, but to understand why a certain reaction constituted moral excellence in the first place. The reflective life became the source code from which all other forms of ethical living drew their principles. He began to see contemplation as the natural apex of human potential. It was here that man achieved his distinctive brilliance. He recognized that while bodily satisfaction and social harmony were important components of a flourishing life, they were ultimately dependent upon the continuous cultivation of rationality. The joy derived from solving a complex theoretical problem, or mapping out an intricate logical system, produced a sustainable happiness, unlike anything found in transient victories or temporary pleasure. This was intellectual satisfaction at its purest, a feeling born not of having acquired something, but of having understood something. It was the sublime reward of comprehension. The gradual acceptance of this supreme good brought with it a certain detachment. When one's greatest source of fulfillment is internal and conceptual, external events lose their ability to shake the core sense of self-worth. Wealth can be taken, friendship can falter, even public honor can vanish overnight. But the sheer act of thoughtful contemplation, the moment of piercing insight that makes everything click into place, that remains a resource only available through sustained effort and disciplined thought. It became, for him, the ultimate anchor against the unpredictable tides of human existence. Yet, this elevation of pure thought did not lead to intellectual arrogance or solitude. On the contrary, it compelled him toward a deeper integration with humanity. He saw that true contemplation was never merely an act of solitary rumination. It had to be tested, debated, and lived out in conversation. The ideas gleaned from the quiet library needed to flow into the noisy forum of debate. They needed to inform how he mentored a friend or advised a community leader. Pure theory remained academic until it passed through the filter of human experience. The knowledge gained by contemplating was powerful, but its ethical value only manifested when guided by the wisdom cultivated in action. Thus, contemplation settled not as an end unto itself, but as the guiding force behind a well-lived life. It provided the ultimate why, the deep philosophical architecture that supported all the scaffolding of habit and social duty. The art of living well was thus understood to be cyclical, using rigorous thought to understand virtue, then acting on that understanding through disciplined practice, which in turn generates new questions for further contemplation, ensuring a continuous spiral toward deeper wisdom. This synthesis solidified his vision of eudaimonia, not merely the successful completion of tasks or the accumulation of praise, but the ongoing state of being fully realized as an intellectual and ethical agent, always striving to understand the beautiful and complex structure of existence itself. The student had absorbed the profound lessons of introspection. He knew that wealth was brittle and fleeting. He understood that emotion demanded a careful calibration, finding the balance point in every reaction. Furthermore, he had tasted the deep satisfaction found in pure thought, the limitless horizon offered by contemplation. But these understandings felt separate from the lived experience of man. He now confronted the core practical challenge presented by Aristotle. Knowledge alone is insufficient. To merely understand what courage means is to know nothing at all. True goodness, he realized with a startling clarity, requires action. It demands a deliberate commitment, a physical and habitual cultivation that molds character from abstract theory into tangible being. The old philosopher spoke not in lofty pronouncements about the ideal man, but through examples of daily struggle. Virtue was presented to him as a craft, one requiring the relentless practice of discipline. Just as a musician does not simply read the sheet music, but must play it again and again until the notes flow naturally from the fingers, so too must a virtuous life be lived. This understanding represented a fundamental pivot in his philosophical journey. The pursuit shifted from contemplation as an end in itself to viewing action as the primary arena for self-actualization. Being good was not merely adopting a viewpoint, it was adopting a way of life, a persistent, conscious effort that reshaped one's disposition. He contemplated moments where he had understood justice perfectly, the theoretical difference between fairness and punitive judgment. Yet, When faced with the messy reality of human conflict, words failed him. The perfect definition could not prevent anger from boiling over, nor could it ensure temperance during a moment of intense frustration. Knowledge was passive. Ethical virtue required force, applied continuously. The student observed friends acting out their convictions, some struggling greatly. He saw peers who understood the theory of moderation, but whose impulsive words or sudden bouts of resentment betrayed their inner dissonance. They were scholars by book, yet amateur practitioners in life. This disparity created a deep internal conflict for him. If virtue demanded more than mere intellectual assent, then where did one even begin? It felt less like understanding truth and more like building muscle through sheer repetition. The mind was powerful, yes, but it was not immune to habit. Poor habits bred bad responses, much like weak muscles lead to physical frailty. The philosopher challenged this limitation head-on. He emphasized that virtues, kindness, bravery, honesty, were all acquired dispositions. They were skills built through the consistent performance of right action until they became second nature. One did not become brave by reading about heroes. One became brave by acting bravely when it was difficult. This meant that ethical life was fundamentally a process of becoming. It rejected any notion of an innate, fixed character or a sudden flash of enlightenment making one whole. Instead, it posited a slow, arduous climb, a daily commitment to choosing the right path over the easy one, repeatedly, until choice became identity. He started applying this concept immediately. He needed to move past simply knowing that responding with measured empathy was virtuous and start doing it every time. Every time a disagreement arose in the agora, he trained himself not just to reason logically, but to physically pause, to feel the impulse of retaliation, and then consciously redirect that energy toward understanding. It was taxing work. It demanded immense vigilance against slipping back into old patterns, the comfort of reaction, the ease of anger, the temptation of self-pity. This forced engagement turned philosophy from a leisurely study into a demanding apprenticeship for the soul. The student realized that every small act of deliberate moral choice accumulated weight. The consistent choice to speak truth gently, the habit of forgiving unjustly offered slighted neighbors, the routine practice of admitting when he was wrong. These were not minor footnotes in a life, but the very mortar holding the edifice of character together. They were the proofs of his ongoing commitment to flourishing. Flourishing, Eudaimonia, therefore, was revealed not as a single destination point marked by great achievement or perfect contemplation, but as the accumulated trajectory of virtuous practice. It was the consistent motion itself, the process of exercising one's potential toward moral excellence, moment after challenging moment. The theory had given him the map, but only the habit could give him the strength to walk the path. The journey of self-discovery has brought the student to a place where abstract knowledge seems thin and pale against the vivid complexity of human life. Up until now, his quest for the good had focused inward, mastering his own temper, refining his thought through contemplation, and understanding that virtue itself was an acquired habit, a daily practice of self-correction. Yet, in the heart of this thriving, imperfect city, the living city, he finds himself faced with something much harder than internal discipline, the challenge of the other person. He is placed at the center of a dispute. Two neighbors stand locked in bitter disagreement over a shared boundary, their words hardened by resentment and stubborn pride. They represent not just two individuals, but the volatile frictions that define community life, the space where theory dissolves into messy emotion. To navigate this requires a different kind of wisdom, one that does not merely calibrate the self, but must reconcile opposing wills. Initially, the student approaches the scene with the intellectual detachment honed in his studies. He attempts to apply logical arguments. If you acted fairly, your neighbor should reciprocate. Justice dictates an equitable division. But these abstract principles fall flat against the impassioned cries and deep-seated grievances of the men involved. Their pain is not merely a lack of property. It is rooted in pride, perceived slights, and deeply held emotional narratives. He realizes that simply stating what ought to be done is useless when hearts are wounded by resentment. The dispute is therefore not a matter of measurements or deeds. It is an ethical knot tied by interpersonal emotions. The weight of this realization forces him to expand his definition of the good life. Eudaimonia, until now understood as a rigorous internal state of flourishing achieved through personal excellence, suddenly feels insufficient if it cannot accommodate the messy reality of genuine human connection and communal harmony. He must learn that one's own perfected inner life is not a fortress against the world. Rather, it is a necessary foundation from which to engage with it responsibly. The task before him becomes mediating something far more volatile than emotions. He must mediate justice itself, as understood by the messy confluence of human relationships. He begins the process not with a judgment, but with deep listening. He does not refute claims. He seeks understanding for the underlying needs and fears that fuel the arguments. One man speaks only of loss, feeling deprived of his ancestral claim. The other speaks only of principle, feeling wronged by perceived unfairness. The student observes the gap between what they demand, the boundary marker, and what they truly need, recognition and emotional safety. This act of empathetic listening is surprisingly difficult, demanding a temporary suspension of his own superior judgment in favor of shared human vulnerability. He must become the conduit for communication, not the judge of fact. It is here that he encounters the concept of empathy, or perhaps more accurately, justice extending beyond mere legal writ. Justice requires him to see the conflict through the eyes of both parties, acknowledging the validity of their hurt even if his own reasoning suggests they are mistaken. The challenge escalates as simple mediation proves impossible. The neighbor's grievances have taken root too deeply. Logic alone cannot uproot them. He realizes that virtue does not function in a vacuum. His self-mastery, which had been so impressive, now feels incomplete without its outward application to the community. True ethical flourishing must therefore involve tending to the delicate ecosystem of human relationships. This realization triggers an internal reckoning. If my inner tranquility is only half the equation, and community harmony is the other half, then I cannot achieve the complete picture of the good life until both are addressed simultaneously. His focus shifts from analyzing individual emotional responses to structuring a mechanism of justice that restores mutual respect while respecting established principles. He begins to articulate not merely rules, but responsibilities. The responsibility each person has to actively participate in the well-being of their shared world. This is the beginning of the ethical ripple effect. The small disagreement over land ownership morphs into a profound teaching about how individual actions inevitably reverberate outward, shaping the emotional and material landscape of everyone around them. He understands that self-mastery is preparation for community responsibility. It is not an end in itself, but a powerful tool to be used at the service of others. The pursuit of eudaimonia thus expands from personal excellence into social ethics, making the good life inseparable from the lives of those who share its space. He must learn to wield his virtue not as armor against the world, but as an offering to it. Having mastered the careful balance of emotion and understood that virtue demands daily habit, the student now faced a different kind of challenge. His philosophy had previously dealt with abstract principles, with justice in dispute, or moderation in feeling. Now, he found himself drawn into activities that required physical skill combined with deep mental engagement. He began to observe masters at work, whether it was the careful precision of carpentry or the demanding structure of a formal debate. These were not just tasks, they were arenas for self-discovery. The initial attempts were uneven. When confronted with genuine difficulty, the student would falter. His mind wandered back to theoretical texts, seeking an intellectual answer instead of relying on practiced dexterity. He realized that thinking about how good one should be was vastly different from simply being good in the moment. The gap between knowledge and execution felt immense. One day, working with a skilled artisan who carved intricate wooden sculptures, the student watched the process unfold. The master did not overthink each curve or chisel stroke, he merely flowed into it. There was an almost trance-like focus, a seamless merging of his expertise with the material reality of the wood. His movements were economical, precise, and utterly joyful in their efficiency. This observation sparked a profound shift in understanding. The master was not simply performing a task, he was operating within what could be called a state of flow. It is a psychological sweet spot where the challenge level perfectly matches one's skill set. Too little challenge, and the mind grew bored and distracted. Too much challenge, and anxiety took over. The student began to apply this principle not just to physical crafts, but to intellectual pursuits as well. He approached a demanding debate or the careful structuring of an argument by tuning his internal resources. He learned to identify those sweet spots, the topics that sparked natural curiosity, the areas where rigorous practice made him feel effortlessly competent. The true revelation was that flow is not merely a momentary state of pleasure. It is a signpost pointing toward genuine engagement with excellence. When one reaches this alignment, when the self, the action, and the challenge become one, the activity itself becomes deeply rewarding. The struggle for validation fades away because the value is inherent in the process. He realized that eudaimonia, or flourishing, was not a grand philosophical conclusion to be reached from an ivory tower. It was scattered across moments of perfect immersion. It existed in the deep concentration required to argue a complex ethical point flawlessly. It resided in the quiet satisfaction of mastering a difficult physical skill, and even in the simple act of tending to his own life with focused attention. The implications were vast. If flourishing could be found in these specific, challenging moments, these states of flow, it meant that happiness was not something you waited for, but something you actively created through focused effort. The self-worth derived from deep immersion became a fundamental pillar of living well, rivaling even the satisfaction gained from pure contemplation. This understanding deepened his commitment to action over mere theory. He saw that true wisdom does not allow one to stand safely apart and merely observe life. Instead, it demands participation. One must immerse oneself in the world's challenges, be they emotional, intellectual, or manual, and engage fully. For it is only through the resistance of a task, within the sweet spot of capability, that true excellence can be polished into existence. This newfound appreciation for embodied practice enriched his view of ethics, preparing him to see how his personal state of optimal engagement would ripple outward and affect the communities he loved. The flow state became a practical model for ethical living. Find the balance between what you know and what you must yet learn, dedicating yourself fully to that precise space. It taught him that self-actualization is therefore fundamentally an active, continuous practice, requiring not just moral intent, but dedicated concentration in every facet of life. We have traveled far from the simple answers of gold or glory. We established that true flourishing is neither found in accumulation nor merely in brilliant thought, but resides in the careful balance between them. The self, like an athletic form, must be trained through daily effort, finding its sweet spot where challenge meets skill. Yet, even after mastering the inner battle, the tempering of rage into measured action, the refinement of contemplation into sustained wisdom, a profound emptiness remains if that wisdom is held solely within the confines of one's own mind. The philosopher, however isolated in his study, realizes he is not a complete circuit. There are vital forces at play that cannot be mapped by pure reason or contained within the quiet discipline of self-mastery. He turns his gaze outward, away from the lecture hall and into the vibrant, messy tapestry of human connection. Here, the great question resurfaces. How does one navigate the shared landscape of another soul? What gives meaning to an existence that has been so rigorously disciplined? After understanding the necessity of ethical action and finding joy in the practiced flow state, a quiet dread settles upon the student. He has mastered his emotions. He knows that virtue is effort, not instinct. Yet, an unseen weight presses upon him, the crushing realization that all these lessons require time. Time spent pondering abstract concepts feels insufficient against the backdrop of real life's demands. The mind grapples with a profound and painful fear, the potential unreached. It is the dread of living an incomplete life, a life defined by missed opportunities and theoretical understanding rather than embodied experience. He watches others, friends, skilled artisans, thoughtful leaders, living lives marked by visible depth, lives full of messy contradiction and joyous effort. His own journey, while rich in intellectual discovery, feels contained, confined to the halls of thought. This is not merely regret for wasted hours. It is a philosophical confrontation with potentiality itself. To know what one could become, to grasp the structure of perfect virtue or the depth of true understanding, is agonizingly separate from the actual act of becoming that thing. The gap between knowing and doing widens into a chasm, threatening to undermine every lesson learned. He realizes that inaction is not merely passive, it is an active form of suffering. A life stalled by intellectual analysis alone is inherently incomplete. He feels the subtle tug-of-war. On one hand, the comfort of study and reflection, which has been his sanctuary. On the other, the undeniable pull toward engagement, toward risk, toward the messy reality that demands a full expenditure of self. This fear forces him to reassess the definition of success. Is success found in the mastery of concepts, or in the meaningful application of those concepts? If wisdom is useless unless it informs action, then knowledge alone holds no intrinsic good. The value must lie in the translation of thought into lived reality. The student spends days wrestling with this anxiety. He considers mentors who achieved great things, great philosophers, great builders, great speakers, and questions if their brilliance was merely a byproduct of relentless, often painful, engagement. He starts to understand that potential is not a static treasure waiting to be unveiled. It is something perishable, requiring constant tending and courageous deployment. To fail to act, having been granted the capacity for greatness, feels like a profound moral failure. He begins to see this fear of unlived potential as a necessary motivator, a sharp, clarifying pain that keeps him moving forward. It is the realization that human existence demands expenditure. The life worth living cannot be merely contemplated. It must be lived out until the very last possibility has been fully utilized. This recognition shifts his understanding from an ideal state to a vigorous mandate. The contemplation of inaction prepares him for a much harsher truth. The boundaries of power and effort are far more complex than any ethical treatise suggests. The sheer scope of human suffering, the capricious nature of fate, and the unavoidable losses that punctuate even the most carefully crafted lives loom large in his consciousness. This gnawing feeling of not having enough time, or perhaps not being strong enough to realize every noble aim, brings him face to face with a far deeper philosophical problem than simply becoming virtuous. He must now contend with things outside the reach of will and effort, things beyond personal habituation. He approaches these inevitable limitations not as failures, but as necessary components of wisdom itself. The lesson moves from self-mastery to acceptance, understanding that genuine flourishing requires a radical acknowledgement of what one cannot change, thereby freeing all energy for what remains within the sphere of his control. The tapestry of life, it seems, is woven with threads both brilliant and fragile. We have spent time mastering the self, controlling volatile emotions like anger or despair, finding balance through moderation in every feeling. We learned that true excellence comes not from pure thought alone, nor solely from external achievement, but from consistent, skilled action. Yet, the deepest moments of reflection force us to confront a wilderness far more challenging than our own temperaments: the vastness of chance. The world remains indifferent to our wisdom. It does not care how much we contemplate or how perfectly we execute our craft. Sometimes, life delivers a blow that no amount of moral preparation can soften. We face unavoidable loss. We observe the inevitable decay of things we once cherished, a beloved institution, a deeply personal connection, or perhaps even the steady rhythm of one's own physical health. These moments pull us back to the fundamental limits of our power. Our careful edifice of self-mastery suddenly feels shaky when faced with sheer happenstance. The mind, in its struggle for control, attempts to build elaborate shields against this chaos. It revises history countless times, searching for a controllable variable, a moment where we acted differently, spoke more wisely, or simply possessed more foresight. This desperate attempt to retroactively impose order upon the random becomes a subtle form of suffering. To dwell in these what-ifs is exhausting. It traps the spirit in a loop of regret and grievance, draining the energy required for present virtuous action. We must eventually reach a profound realization. There is a necessary separation between those elements we can influence, our judgments, our habits, our response to tragedy, and those immutable currents that move the world. The teaching here is one of radical acceptance, not resignation. Acceptance is an active process. It demands that we stop fighting what simply is. It is acknowledging reality as a given fact, not as a personal slight or philosophical failure. Imagine standing before a mighty river, surging and unyielding. You can build walls, you can argue with the current, but ultimately, you must learn to move with it. The struggle against the irreversible is always the deepest human wound. This battle for control is perhaps harder than conquering a momentary outburst of rage, because here, there is no single point of failure, only the ceaseless momentum of time and change. The great wisdom teaches us that our capacity for flourishing rests precisely on this realization of boundaries. True freedom, therefore, is not the ability to dictate outcomes, but the unshakable recognition of what lies outside our jurisdiction. It requires a deep philosophical detachment from desired results, recognizing that value resides entirely within the process of striving itself. We learn to redefine success away from perfect outcomes and toward resilient character. If a life encounters disaster, if joy is fleeting, or if labor ends abruptly, the virtuous person does not crumble. Their foundation, the cultivated moral self, remains intact because it was built upon wisdom about fate, not against it. This acceptance becomes the final polish on our ethical craft. It tempers the desire for perfect control into a profound gratitude for merely having the chance to engage with life at all. It allows us to savor the moment of present action without being crippled by the fear of future loss or past error. The understanding dawns that some goods, like fortune and even strong relationships, are loaned to us, not owned. We must therefore treat them with the delicate reverence they deserve, knowing that their departure is a natural part of the cosmic rhythm. This wisdom completes the arc from theory to embodiment. The highest level of self-mastery is not mastering emotion, nor is it accumulating knowledge. It is learning how beautifully and completely one can navigate tragedy without losing sight of their own inherent dignity. It is embracing life in its messy, uncontrollable fullness, finding meaning not despite suffering, but often because of it. This acceptance does not breed apathy. Far from it. Instead, it becomes a powerful liberation. It strips away the paralyzing weight of expectation and allows our active engagement with justice, craft, and community to be pure, motivated only by intrinsic good, and therefore uncorrupted by the fear of failure or loss. This realization finally solidifies the core principle of eudaimonia. That true human flourishing is a graceful endurance, a disciplined unfolding despite the unpredictable cruelty and beauty of existence itself. The journey to understanding the good life had been a long and arduous pilgrimage. From the shining distractions of glory to the necessary discipline of moderating passion, every lesson had chipped away at the assumptions of youth, leaving only the raw question: what truly constitutes flourishing? Now, standing on the threshold of this final understanding, the student understood that any single concept, be it pure contemplation, perfect justice, or flawless emotional control, was insufficient by itself. These were powerful components, yes, but they did not form a whole edifice. The pursuit had taught him to look inward for discipline and outward for community, only to realize the connection between the two was far more profound than he had imagined. The realization of eudaimonia required synthesis. It was not an abstract ideal kept safe within lecture halls, nor was it simply a grand achievement waiting at the finish line. To mistake eudaimonia for a final reward, like accumulating wisdom or achieving perfect peace, was the ultimate misunderstanding. Life itself, he finally understood, was a process, a dynamic becoming rather than a static state of being. It demanded engagement with every aspect of existence, the thoughtful application of reason to civic life, the disciplined exercise of virtue in challenging interpersonal moments, and the constant willingness to engage with the unexpected realities of human suffering. He recalled early doubts, the times he had thought wisdom was merely deep thought, detached from the world. But the lessons taught by community dispute revealed that pure contemplation without compassionate action is sterile air. Similarly, the mastery of emotion proved meaningless if it did not guide him toward a decision that upheld justice in the public square. Furthermore, Acknowledging fate and accepting loss had stripped away the comforting illusion that human life could be managed or perfectly predicted. This surrender to reality was not an end. It was the necessary foundation upon which authentic living could finally begin. The greatest revelation, he realized, lay in the active rhythm of engagement. Eudaimonia was found in the doing itself, in the continuous act of self-improvement and moral striving. It was the ongoing process of adjusting one's will to align with its highest potential, day after day. This definition transformed his understanding from a goalpost into a permanent compass bearing. The life worth living became inherently temporal. It belonged wholly to the present moment, which demanded disciplined participation. This required integrating all the lessons like threads weaving into a durable tapestry. He needed the intellectual rigor of contemplation to guide his moral judgments, yet he could not let that intellect become separate from humanity. Courage had to manifest in speech. Temperance had to shape his spending and relationships. Every virtuous choice, every act of disciplined empathy was simply another step along this meandering path toward fulfilling one's inherent human function. The student felt a profound weight lift, replaced by an equally profound sense of responsibility. To live according to Eudaimonia meant more than feeling good or even succeeding. It meant realizing the fullest scope of what humanity is capable of, a being that reason and action must guide together, supported by connection, moderated by self-awareness, and anchored by acceptance. It was a continuous apprenticeship in human excellence. He saw now that every challenge he had faced, every frustration, every loss, every moment of deep focus on a craft or an idea had not been merely something to overcome. They were the very materials required for construction. Suffering did not negate virtue, it sharpened its edges. Limitation did not prevent flourishing, it defined the parameters within which true freedom could operate. The disciplined acceptance of one's limited control over outcomes paradoxically granted him complete mastery over his inner response, giving him a bedrock stability upon which all other forms of virtue could stand. The profound nature of this realization was that eudaimonia was not something bestowed by the gods or earned through luck. It was something human beings are designed to build. It is an activity. It is the relentless pursuit of one's excellent self, making philosophy less a field of study and more a way of intense, lived being. This recognition closed the circular questioning of his entire life, finally providing a framework that felt both immense in its scope and immediate in its demands. The good life, he understood, was simply the fully engaged life, a magnificent journey of becoming. The student had stood at the peak of his understanding. He had grappled with wealth and stripped it bare. He had mastered the quick temper, learning that restraint was not suppression but balance. He had found deep contentment in the quiet chambers of pure thought, recognizing wisdom as its own supreme reward. Yet, he knew this journey could not end with a single epiphany. The weight of understanding itself pressed down on him. Where did one conclude a life dedicated to questioning? Was there an end point to wisdom, or was the pursuit itself the destination? He began to feel a creeping sense of disorientation. All the rules, the mean emotion, the necessity of action, the quiet bliss of contemplation, felt magnificent, yet they seemed incomplete if treated as discrete milestones. A lifetime of learning felt less like a steady path and more like a series of peaks, each conquered but leaving him standing in an unfamiliar valley below the summit. He looked down at his own hands, noticing the calluses and the subtle weariness that came not from physical labor, but from constant mental exertion. This realization struck him with unexpected force. Wisdom was not an accumulation, nor a final destination marked by a plaque of achievement. It was merely momentum. The deepest philosophical understanding he had achieved until now was the recognition that nothing we deem truly good is ever finished. Perfection, in human terms, is always provisional. If virtue were a statue to be sculpted once and then admired forever, it would inevitably crumble under the touch of time or the challenge of reality. But the self, the philosopher, was not static marble. He was constantly forming clay, needing continuous reshaping. The notion of being done felt profoundly unsettling, almost dangerous, because it implied a period of leisure, a permission to stop examining, questioning, and refining one's deepest assumptions. To achieve eudaimonia had previously sounded like finding the right state of being, the optimal balance between thought and action, tempered by acceptance. Now he understood that optimal was an ever-moving target. It shifted with cultural shifts, personal failures, unexpected joy, and unforeseen grief. He found himself observing his peers, the younger students, arguing about minor ethical dilemmas, disputes over justice in a marketplace, or whether kindness required sacrifice. To their heated debates, he listened not as an expert offering final pronouncements, but as a student watching others struggle through necessary imperfection. They debated methods of self-improvement, forgetting that the primary subject was themselves, right now, moment by agonizing moment. This brought him face to face with the core truth of Aristotle's philosophy, a truth grander and more demanding than any single treatise could contain. Flourishing is not a state achieved. It is an activity performed. It is the ongoing work itself. The intellectual satisfaction he had found in pure contemplation was breathtaking. Yet if that contemplative life led him to neglect his responsibilities to his family or his community, would it truly be human flourishing? He realized that true wisdom did not permit exemption from the messy obligations of daily existence. It demanded participation. To live well required showing up at the argument, at the failed harvest, at the painful conversation with a loved one. The temptation was to retreat into the perfect sanctuary of ideas, believing that elevated thought would protect him from human frailty and unpredictable fortune. But this sheltered life was ultimately sterile. He understood that the disciplined application of the mean, the courage in the face of obvious fear, or the temperance required to say no when it is easier to indulge, was not merely a theoretical exercise. It was physical muscle building for the soul. This meant that every single sunrise presented a fresh chance at failure and thus a new opportunity for refinement. The lifelong apprenticeship became the ultimate definition of virtue. It suggested that the philosopher must adopt the mindset of an eternal student, maintaining gnawing curiosity even when answers seem clear, embracing vulnerability even in moments of perceived certainty. He learned to reframe his understanding of time itself. Time was not a river leading inevitably toward decay or rest. It was a workbench, and every single passing moment, whether spent debating abstract physics with skepticism or simply helping an elderly neighbor carry firewood, represented a fresh surface awaiting the chisel of habit and the polish of reflection. The greatest danger, he concluded, was intellectual complacency. The moment one believes they have mastered enough knowledge that further effort is unnecessary. This belief would lead not to rest, but to atrophy. He accepted this truth with profound humility. Wisdom became less about what you knew, and more about how willing you were to continue asking questions, even the embarrassing, basic ones. His quest shifted from finding the good life to perpetually becoming better equipped for the life unfolding before him. It was a continuous calibration of judgment against reality. He recognized that his inner calm was not some permanent achievement, but the result of consistently choosing the difficult, thoughtful path over the easy, reactive one. And that choice, repeated day after relentless day, defined the span of a worthwhile existence. The philosophical ascent was thus revealed to be merely the necessary preparation for the ceaseless descent and rise that constitutes human life itself. He left his studies with this understanding. The greatest reward is not what you find, but the perpetual discipline of the search. It is the accepting embrace of being forever in progress, perpetually learning, eternally